This morning we're going to study chapters 16 to 18 of the book of Exodus. I've looked at these chapters and tried to select parts of them, but found that I couldn't do so. So I'm going to read all of this. It won't take too long, and it gives us the whole sweep of the story. I'll begin reading at verse 22 of Exodus chapter 15. Exodus 15, verse 22, reading through to the end of chapter 18. Then Moses led the people of Israel on from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the wilderness of Shur, and were there 3 days without water. Arriving at Marah, they couldn't drink the water because it was bitter. That is why the place was called Marah, meaning bitter. Then the people turned against Moses. "Must we die of thirst?" they demanded. Moses pleaded with the Lord to help them. And the Lord showed him a tree to throw into the water, and the water became sweet. It was there at Marah that the Lord laid before them the following conditions to test their commitment to him. "If you will listen to the voice of the Lord your God and obey it and do what is right, then I will not make you suffer the diseases I send on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." And they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there beside the springs. Now they left Elim and journeyed on into the Sin wilderness, between Elim and Mount Sinai, arriving there on the 15th day of the 2nd month after leaving Egypt. There too the people spoke bitterly against Moses and Aaron. "Oh, that we were back in Egypt," they moaned, "and that the Lord had killed us there. For there we had plenty to eat. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to kill us with starvation." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for them. Everyone can go out each day and gather as much food as he needs, and I will test them in this, to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. Tell them to gather twice as much as usual on the 6th day of the week." Then Moses and Aaron called a meeting of all the people of Israel and told them, "This evening you will realize it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In the morning you will see more of his glory, for he has heard your complaints against him. For you aren't really complaining against us. Who are we? The Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and bread in the morning. Come now before Jehovah and hear his reply to your complaints." So Aaron called them together, and suddenly out toward the wilderness, from within the guiding cloud, there appeared the awesome glory of Jehovah. And Jehovah said to Moses, "I have heard their complaints. Tell them, in the morning you will have meat, and in the evening you will be stuffed with bread, and you shall know that I am Jehovah your God." That evening vast numbers of quail arrived and covered the camp, and in the morning the desert all around the camp was wet with dew. And when the dew disappeared later in the morning, it left tiny flakes of something as small as hoarfrost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they asked each other, "What is it?" And Moses told them, "It is the food Jehovah has given you to eat. Jehovah has said for everyone to gather as much as is needed for his household, about 3 quarts for each person in his home." So the people of Israel went out and gathered it, and when they poured it into a 3-quart measure, there was just enough for everyone, 3 quarts apiece. Those who gathered a lot had nothing left over. Those who gathered little had no lack. Each home had just enough. And Moses told them, "Don't leave it overnight." But of course some of them wouldn't listen, and left it until morning. And when they looked, it was full of maggots and had a terrible odor. And Moses was very angry with them. So they gathered the food morning by morning, each home according to its need. And when the sun became hot upon the ground, the food melted and disappeared. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much as usual, 6 quarts instead of 3. Then the leaders of the people came and asked Moses why this had been commanded them. And he told them, because the Lord has appointed tomorrow as a day of seriousness and rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord, when we must refrain from doing our daily task. So cook as much as you want to today and keep what is left overnight. And the next morning the food was wholesome and good, without maggots or odor. Moses said, this is your food for today is the Sabbath to Jehovah, and there will be no food on the ground today. Gather the food for 6 days, but the 7th is a Sabbath, and there will be none there for you on that day. But some of the people went out anyway to gather food, even though it was the Sabbath, but there wasn't any. How long will these people refuse to obey? The Lord asked Moses. Don't they realize that I'm giving them twice as much on the 6th day, so that there will be enough for 2 days? For the Lord has given you the 7th day as a Sabbath rest. Stay in your tents and don't go out to pick up food from the ground that day. So the people rested on the 7th day, and the food became known as manna, meaning, what is it? It was white like coriander seed and flat and tasted like honey bread. Then Moses gave them this further instruction from the Lord. They were to take 3 quarts of it to be kept as a museum specimen forever, so that later generations could see the bread the Lord had fed them with in the wilderness when he brought them from Egypt. And Moses told Aaron to get a container and put 3 quarts of manna in it, and to keep it in a sacred place from generation to generation. Aaron did this, just as the Lord had instructed Moses, and eventually it was kept in the Ark of the Tabernacle. So the people of Israel ate the manna 40 years, until they arrived in the land of Canaan, where there were crops to eat. The omer, the container used to measure the manna, held about 3 quarts. It is approximately 1/10 of a bushel. Now at God's command, the people of Israel left the Sin desert, going by easy stages to Rephidim. But upon arrival there was no water. So once more the people growled and complained to Moses. "Give us water," they wailed. "Quiet," Moses commanded. "Are you trying to test God's patience with you?" But tormented by thirst, they cried out, "Why did you ever take us out of Egypt? Why did you bring us here to die, with our children and cattle too?" Then Moses pleaded with Jehovah, "What shall I do? For they are almost ready to stone me." Then Jehovah said to Moses, "Take the elders of Israel with you and lead the people out to Mount Horeb. I will meet you there at the rock and strike it with your rod, the same one you struck the Nile with, and water will come pouring out, enough for everyone." Moses did as he was told, and the water gushed out. Moses named the place Massa, meaning tempting Jehovah to slay us. And sometimes they referred to it as Meribah, meaning argument or strife. For it was there that the people of Israel argued against God and tempted him to slay them by saying, "Is Jehovah going to take care of us or not?" But now the warriors of Amalek came to fight against the people of Israel at Rephidim. Moses instructed Joshua to issue a call to arms to the Israelites to fight the army of Amalek. "Tomorrow," Moses told him, "I will stand at the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." So Joshua and his men went out to fight the army of Amalek. Meanwhile, Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. And as long as Moses held up the rod in his hands, Israel was winning. But whenever he rested his arms at his side, the soldiers of Amalek were winning. Moses' arms finally became too tired to hold up the rod any longer. So Aaron and Hur rolled a stone for him to sit on, and they stood on each side, holding up his hands until sunset. As a result, Joshua and his troops crushed the army of Amalek, putting them to the sword. Then the Lord instructed Moses, "Write this into a permanent record to be remembered forever, and announce to Joshua that I will utterly blot out every trace of Amalek." Moses built an altar there and called it Jehovah Nissi, meaning Jehovah is my flag. "Raise the banner of the Lord," Moses said, "for the Lord will be at war with Amalek generation after generation." Incidentally, of course, you can't find the name Amalek on the atlas today because they've gone completely. But Israel is still there. Now the last chapter. Word soon reached Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, the priest of Midian, about all the wonderful things God had done for his people and for Moses, how the Lord had brought them out of Egypt. Then Jethro took Moses' wife, Zipporah, to him, for he had sent her home, along with Moses' 2 sons, Gershom, meaning foreigner, for Moses said when he was born, "I have been wandering in a foreign land," and Eleazar, meaning God is my help. For Moses said at his birth, "The God of my fathers was my helper and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." And they arrived while Moses and the people were camped at Mount Sinai. "Jethro, your father-in-law, has come to visit you," Moses was told, "and he has brought your wife and your 2 sons." Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and greeted him warmly. They asked about each other's health and then went into Moses' tent to talk further. Moses related to his father-in-law all that had been happening and what the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians in order to deliver Israel, and all the problems there had been along the way, and how the Lord had delivered his people from all of them. Jethro was very happy about everything the Lord had done for Israel and about his bringing them out of Egypt. "Bless the Lord," Jethro said, "for he has saved you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh and has rescued Israel. I know now that the Lord is greater than any other God, because he delivered his people from the proud and cruel Egyptians." Jethro offered sacrifices to God, and afterwards Aaron and the leaders of Israel came to meet Jethro, and they all ate the sacrificial meal together before the Lord. The next day Moses sat as usual to hear the people's complaints against each other, from morning to evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw how much time this was taking, he said, "Why are you trying to do all this alone, with people standing here all day long to get your help?" "Well, because the people come to me with their disputes to ask for God's decisions," Moses told him. "I am their judge, deciding who is right and who is wrong, and instructing them in God's ways. I apply the laws of God to their particular disputes." "It's not right," his father-in-law exclaimed. "You're going to wear yourself out, and if you do, what will happen to the people? Moses, this job is too heavy a burden for you to try to handle all yourself. Now listen, and let me give you a word of advice, and God will bless you. Be these people's lawyer, their representative before God, bringing him their questions to decide. You will tell them his decisions, teaching them God's laws, and showing them the principles of godly living. Find some capable, godly, honest men who hate bribes, and appoint them as judges. 1 judge for each 1,000 people. He in turn will have 10 judges under him, each in charge of 100. And under each of them will be 2 judges, each responsible for the affairs of 50 people, and each of these will have 5 judges beneath them, each counseling 10 persons. Let these men be responsible to serve the people with justice at all times. Anything that is too important or complicated can be brought to you. But the smaller matters they can take care of themselves. That way it will be easier for you because you will share the burden with them. If you follow this advice, and if the Lord agrees, you will be able to endure the pressures, and there will be peace and harmony in the camp. Moses listened to his father-in-law's advice and followed this suggestion. He chose able men from all over Israel and made them judges over the people, thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They were constantly available to administer justice. They brought the hard cases to Moses, but judged the smaller matters themselves. And soon afterwards, Moses let his father-in-law return to his own land. When God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, he didn't take them straight into Canaan. The milk and the honey were waiting there for them, but he didn't take them straight there. He led them through the wilderness. And it's a pretty rough and barren place. And they had some very tough experiences there. Now, why did God do this? For the same reason as he leaves us on earth after we've become Christians. Why doesn't he take us straight to glory? We're ready to go. We'd love to go. It would be so nice to step into heaven as soon as we were converted. But he leaves us on earth. And from time to time, our experiences on earth are a bit of a wilderness. The answer is that the wilderness is God's school. That's where you learn. This is where Jesus himself learned. We're told in the New Testament that he learned obedience by the things he suffered. Where did he suffer to learn obedience? The answer is 6 weeks in the wilderness after his baptism. Tonight we are going to be baptizing a dozen or so Christians. And they will have a wilderness following their baptism. They will have battles. They will have the kind of experiences that Israel had in the few days after they went through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses. And I want to look with you this morning at 6 experiences they had, all of which are written down that we might learn in the school of obedience to God. You learn in the wilderness how to follow God's instructions. And you learn this, that when you follow God's instructions, things work out right. But when you follow your own thinking, things go badly. And that's a very hard lesson to learn. But let's see how they learned it. Let me sum up by saying this. They learned in the wilderness 3 things about God and 3 things about themselves. And these are the 2 great lessons in the school of the wilderness: to learn what God is really like and to learn what you are really like. To learn how wonderful he is and to learn how dreadful you are. And these are lessons that usually come as you go through the Christian life. They don't come at the beginning. It's as you go through the wilderness with God. You learn how wonderful he is. You learn how dreadful you are. Take, first of all, the things you learn about God. You will learn, first of all, that he is there with you. His presence is a great thing to learn. It doesn't matter whether you're having a great time by the pools and palm trees of Elim, or whether you're having a bitterly disappointing time at Marah. God is there. And you learn that his presence goes with you every step of the way. The second thing you learn about God is that he protects you. His protection in times of danger, in times of attack. His protection you need to learn, so that when you face the enemy, you trust him. And the third thing you learn about God is what we call his providence, which simply means that he's a marvelous provider. That he provides everything that you need at the time you need, and just the amount you need, no more, no less. And that's a lovely lesson to learn. That God's presence will be with you, that God's protection will be with you, that God's providence will be with you. 3 wonderful things. The 3 things that you learn about yourself are these. First of all, you will learn that you are frail, that you're very weak. You will learn in the wilderness that you very quickly come to the end of your own resources. You learn in the wilderness that you're just not big enough to cope. And secondly, you learn not only your frailty, but you discover the flesh. And you discover the pull of Egypt. That's another lesson you need to learn, and the Israelites learned it. And thirdly, you will learn in the wilderness your faithlessness. That God, having helped you time after time after time, you can still get to the point where you doubt whether He's going to help you. You can still grumble, you can still complain. Now, every Christian in this church could make a list this long as your arm, of times when God has helped them in the past. And yet, if we are honest, we still say that we do not know that tomorrow we may not doubt Him and grumble or complain or wonder whether He's going to see us through. You need to learn your own faithlessness. And putting together human frailty and human flesh and human faithlessness, put that together with God's presence, God's protection, and God's providence, and you've got the answer. Indeed, you need to realize both. You need to realize how low you are to find out how high God is. You need to learn how faithless you are to learn how faithful He is. In the grumblings and complainings of the children of Israel here, do you notice that God hardly rebuked them? He helped them. Isn't that amazing? They grumbled that they had no water, that they had no food, and that they were having to fight, and that the way was tough. They grumbled about everything. And yet God said, it's all right. I'll give you food. I'll give you water. I'll fight for you. I'll get you there. The patience of God with us is just past praise. Now we look at the various incidents that occurred in these 3 chapters, and I'm only giving you the outline of these incidents. I want you to go home, and I hope you do on a Sunday afternoon or sometime. Sit down with your Bible, read through again the part we've studied, and ask God to bring it alive for you and speak to you again in the privacy of your own home and help you to face life. Very quickly, after all the excitement of leaving Egypt and getting baptized in the Red Sea, they came into the wilderness of Shur. There's a wilderness to be faced fairly soon in the Christian life. After all the excitement of conversion and the excitement of getting baptized, sooner or later you find yourself in a bit of a monotonous patch. And the excitement's gone. And things aren't happening anymore. There are no miracles to watch, and you're just plodding on. And the Lord takes you through the wilderness that you might learn to plod. A plodding Christian goes places. Far further sometimes than those who have a tearing hurry at the beginning, and then they stop for a while, and then they have another bit of a run, and then they stop. Those who just go on plodding, walking the way of God, get places. Now they came into this place and it was dry. They began to run out of their water. It was monotonous and tiresome, the wilderness of Shur. And then in the distance they saw something they thought was going to be the answer. And they saw some trees. And they realized there was water. And at first they may have thought it was a mirage. But as they got nearer they realized it was real. And they came running up to the pool and they drank it and it was undrinkable. I know something of this because out in Arabia we drank water from artesian wells that came up through a natural deposit of Epsom salts. And they came up terribly hot. And they were just undrinkable waters. And I know the kind of thing that's referred to, full of minerals in the heat of the desert. And there was this lovely pool, and they threw themselves down on the sand, put their tongues in it, and undrinkable. After a monotonous, tiresome patch, a big disappointment. Now, I think every Christian has faced this kind of thing. Something they thought was going to turn out better than it did. Something on which they'd pinned their hopes, and it doesn't get fulfilled. They were going to learn a profound lesson about God. God's lesson was, this situation is perfectly all right, provided you add to it what I will show you. Now that's his lesson. Not the circumstances are all wrong. They're all right, provided you will add to the situation what I tell you. Now in this case he told them to throw bits of tree into the water. It may interest you to know that the Arabs still do this. And there are at least 3 trees of which they strip the bark and throw the bark into the water. I'm told something about it causing the minerals to deposit or to precipitate, to use the proper technical term. But apparently Arabs still do this to purify water. Now, if that is the explanation, or if that is what has happened, or whether it was a direct miracle and really had nothing to do with the tree at all, but their faith in doing what God told them, I do not know. I only know that they needed to be shown by God how to put the situation right. That's all. And that's the only lesson I want to draw from this particular incident. That when you've been going through a bad patch, a disappointing, tiresome patch, and then some hope on which you've pinned your future collapses and you're bitterly disappointed, and you could be easily resentful and bitter about it. The word Mara means bitter, because the water was bitter, but the Israelis were bitter too. The whole situation was bitter. And God said, I will tell you what to add to this situation that will sweeten it. And then you'll be all right. That's a profound lesson to learn. And the interesting thing is that it was there at Mara that God gave himself a new name. He had already called himself I Am, but now he gave a surname to it. I am the God who heals. You will notice as they go through the wilderness that at the places everything is fine, like Elim, they do not learn another thing about God. No new name for God is given. But when they get to the disappointing places, the difficult places, the battles, it is then that they learn more about God. And I will tell you this, that if your Christian life has been smooth and straightforward and simple and easy, then there are many names of God that you won't have got to know. But when you're really in trouble, when you're bitterly disappointed, when you're going through a bad patch, it is then that you discover more about God. And God says, I am the God who heals you. In fact, God said at that bitter place, the place where they felt the water wasn't even fit to drink, he said, now look, you can drink it if you do what I tell you. And I will keep you from all the diseases of Egypt if you just follow my instructions. In other words, you don't need to be afraid of drinking bad water. If you're following my instructions, I'll look after that side of it. Clearly they were afraid that if they went on drinking it, they would get disease. They had known what bad water in Egypt did, and so they were afraid of disease. And he says, follow my instructions, and I am the God who heals. And if I tell you to drink, it's all right. You know, Jesus said something pretty startling. He said to his disciples, you could take up snakes, yet they wouldn't harm you. There are missionaries who can tell you that that's exactly what God has done for them. In other words, if I tell you to do a thing, follow my instructions, you're all right. Nothing can happen to you. They moved on from Mara, and the next thing they came up against was a lovely oasis with 70 palm trees and 12 springs. Can you imagine it? After Mara. There was a dear old lay preacher up in the Shetland Islands where I began my ministry 21 years ago, and he was a real character. And he once preached in one church 82 sermons, one on each of the springs and one on each of the palm trees. And the congregation had to go through every spring and every palm tree here, and he found a meaning for every one of them. That was this dear old lay preacher. But he knew what the word Elim meant, that's why. He had found the refreshment that God can sometimes give you. All right, you've had a bad patch, you've gone through a dry period, you've had a bitter disappointment, which, when handed to God, turned out right. And then, quite to your surprise, a bit further along, there's a lovely blessing just waiting. We've all had our Elims. And the figures 12 and 70 are always very interesting. You find throughout the Bible, and I don't think I'm reading too much into them, that 12 and 70 are always the figures of God's ministry to people, through people. He called 12 apostles. He sent out 70, 2 by 2. You get these two numbers associated with God sending the right people to do something. And the spiritual meaning of Elim to me is this, that when you need it, God will give you a ministry that will be so refreshing. I have found that from time to time. When I've been drained, when I've been needing help, God has just led me to go and sit under a man's ministry that has been just right for me. And I've been ministered to. I've drunk from one of the springs. I've eaten the dates off one of the palm trees. One of God's placed ministries. And it's helped me through. Thank God for the Elims of this life. But you notice that they didn't learn anything new about God at Elim. And if they had stayed at Elim, sorry, you might read too much into that. I'm not referring to any denomination today. If you stay at Elim, if you stay at the place like that and say, this is great, let's camp here. Let's build houses here. We've got enough to eat and enough to drink. Let's not move on. Then I'm afraid that's as far as you'll go in your knowledge of God. God made no new revelation of his name or his nature at Elim. He just refreshed them and said, now move on. And they moved on. So from the place of delight, they moved on. And for the last time, they saw Egypt on the far side of the Red Sea, for now they were going to turn inland. Have I got my map? They were coming down the eastern shore of the Red Sea here, towards Sinai. And at a certain point around here, they would leave the coast and head inland through the wilderness that we've got here, the wilderness of Sin, S-I-H-N. And from the point at the coast at which they would head inland there, they would catch their last glimpse of Egypt. So it had a significance for them. They were now really leaving sight of the land that they'd lived in. And so they were thinking about all they'd known there. And you know, the food had been good in Egypt. I know they'd had to eat it in chains, but the food was good. We're told about the garlic and the leeks and the onions and all the stew they had there. It fair makes your mouth water to read what they had eaten in Egypt. And now they were leaving Egypt and its food behind. And they found themselves in the wilderness of Sin. The food was gone. And they were saying, why did you bring us out, Moses? They were blaming Moses, and God said through Moses, I brought you out, not Moses. You followed the cloud, not Moses. I led you this way. In grumbling against Moses, you're grumbling against your Lord. And then God says this, I'm going to give you not only bread, I'll give you meat too. God has a way of providing not just the bare necessities, but a table in the wilderness that's got good things on it as well. Meat. How could God provide bread and meat in the wilderness? This was a real miracle. I've worked out with the help of some commentaries how much bread he supplied. Do you know how much? Something like 40.5 million tons. 40.5 million tons of bread in the middle of a desert. No one else has ever been able to do that. Now, the two ways the food came to them were, of course, the quails. Little birds. Have you ever seen quails? Little birds running around. They migrate in thousands across the Middle East about this time of year. And at night, they are exhausted with flying, and they can only fly just a few feet above the ground, hopping a few yards at a time. Therefore, they're terribly easy to catch. But the thing is that at that very evening, for the first time, quails by the thousand decided to migrate that way through that valley, and they came down in their thousands, so that they had meat that night. And in the morning they got up and they saw this little bread. Now again, there have been attempts to describe it in natural terms as honeydew, as the excretions of the tamarisk tree. All kinds of things have been described to explain this miracle. But the fact that it was God's miracle is proved by certain facts. Number one, there was exactly the right amount, 3 quarts per person. And when they'd gathered every bit off the desert floor, they had exactly 3 quarts for every person in camp, no more, no less. That's incredible. God knew exactly how much to produce. Secondly, there was twice that amount on the Friday morning. Nature doesn't do that kind of thing. Nature works on a 7-day week. Invariably, I remember that when I used to have to get up every Sunday morning at 4 and milk 90 cows before going to church. Nature doesn't stop for God or man in that sense. And yet here, nature did something twice as great on Friday and not at all on the Saturday. Furthermore, the miraculous nature of this bread is seen in the fact that 6 days a week, if they kept any till the morning, it went rotten. But on the 7th day, when they kept it till the morning, it was perfectly fresh. You can't get round the fact that God did this. To keep 2.5 million men, women and children and their animals alive in the middle of a desert. It takes a big God to do that. Now, of course, we see great meaning in this, because Jesus himself gave us the key to unlock the meaning of this, and he said this: I'm the living bread. I'm the bread sent down from heaven. The people who ate the bread in the wilderness, it kept them going another 24 hours, but it didn't keep them going forever. It couldn't. Sooner or later, even if they went on eating it, they would die. And in fact, all but 2 of them did die in the desert, even though they had the manna. But Jesus said, you eat me, and you've got a life that will go on and on and on forever. I'm the real bread you need. And it was in the wilderness that the Israelis learned that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God, and particularly the word that became flesh and dwelt among us. If you would know eternal life now and in the future, it will be by feeding on Christ, the living bread. It's the only way. Otherwise, you are hungry in the wilderness. There's always a famine in this world for those who don't feed on Christ. Sooner or later, you say, I perish here with hunger, and in my Father's house there's bread enough and to spare. Sooner or later, you are dissatisfied with everything the world can offer. And sooner or later, your heart cries out to feed on something else. And Jesus says, feed on me, the living bread. We move on now to the valley of Rephidim, and there they got thirsty. And I suppose that thirst is a good deal worse than hunger. Somebody has said that hunger only affects one organ of your body, your tummy. But thirst, that seems to fill your whole frame with a fire. Thirst is far worse than hunger. And one of the most frightening predictions in our world today is that by 1985 there will be a greater shortage of fresh water than of food. And that by 1985 men and women will be dying of thirst rather than hunger in our world. That I find one of the most frightening things. Thirst is a terrible killer. And they were in the valley of Rephidim, thirsty, no refreshment, parched lips, dry. This can happen spiritually. Hope you're not getting depressed by this morning. I want you to be realistic, because if I do not tell you that there is a way in the wilderness for the Christian, then you will be terribly hurt when you discover this for yourself. Far better you should know it now. You will get to the promised land, but the way lies through the wilderness. And there are times when you are dry and thirsty. A dry patch. Every Christian has known this. How do you get through it? Same way they did there. The people began to push God's patience to the brink. Moses said, you are really pushing God to the very brink of becoming impatient with you. They were complaining and grumbling again. To tempt God is not to try and make him do something wrong, but to try and make him do something right. To tempt God is to push him so far in your unbelief and faithlessness that God says, my patience is exhausted. I will do nothing more for them. And thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. Don't push God too far. Don't play about with his promises so that you doubt him so much that his patience comes to an end for you. And Moses said, this place is called Massah, meaning testing God's patience, pushing God too far in your unbelief. And then he took the rod that had done so much. It was only a shepherd's rod. But then God is a shepherd. And he smote the dry red sandstone of the valley of Rephidim. You can go there today and see that valley. Dry red sandstone. And he struck it. And it cracked where he struck it. And out gushed water. Not just a gallon or two. It must have been thousands upon thousands of gallons flowing across the desert floor. You can see them digging a pool so that it would fill up and the animals could drink, catching it in their pitchers so that they could drink it themselves. And the New Testament says in 1 Corinthians 10, that rock was Christ. In other words, once again, if you're hungry, then feed on Christ. If you're thirsty, drink of Christ. He says if you knew who you were talking to, you would ask me for a drink. To the woman at the well who said, give me to drink and then I won't have to bother to come to this well anymore with my bucket. Trying to laugh it off with a joke. And Jesus said, look, I could give you a spring of water inside you welling up to eternal life. That's the answer to thirst. Why did Jesus say, blessed are those who hunger and thirst? Because they will then learn that God provides. They shall be filled. And if you've never been hungry for more of Christ and never been thirsty for more of His Holy Spirit, then you've not known what it is to be satisfied. But when you hunger and thirst and go to Christ with that hunger and thirst, then the Rock of Ages is all you need. I turn away from these four places where they had these experiences to two groups of people where they learned two more things. For the first time now, they received attacks from an enemy directly. It says the Amalekites who lived away down here, they had emigrated from Persia. They'd lived down here for a time. And they now lived down here. And the Amalekites had married into the tribe of Esau. And the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau were now to meet. Do you know that one of the deepest tensions in the human race for, about 2,000 years was the tension between Jacob and Esau? It went down through their children. And it went right down until finally from Jacob came someone called Jesus, and from Esau came someone called Herod. And when Jesus and Herod met 2,000 years afterwards, it was still Jacob and Esau meeting. Jacob is the man of vision and faith who lives for the future. Esau is the man who lives for the flesh and the present. The man who wants a plate of soup rather than a mention in someone's will. And the Jacobs and the Esau's of this world are always in tension. Those who see the future and live by faith in the future, and those who live for what they can get now and enjoy now. And the battle between Israel and Amalek is the battle that will go on right through history between those who live for the next world and those who live for this one. And that's the battle that was there. The Jacobs and the Esau's. Now we're told that the Amalekites began to kill off the stragglers. Now there's a sermon for you. The people of God who were lagging behind were the ones the Amalekites picked off one by one. It is vital that we keep up in the pilgrimage of life. It's vital that we keep in the people of God. It's those who drop out. It's the stragglers whom the devil gets hold of. It's the stragglers who are picked off one by one. And the Amalekites didn't meet the Israelis head on. They came round the back. And those who were just lagging and those who weren't walking well, those who weren't keeping up, he just picked them off one by one. And so Moses rightly said, we must deal with this together. The fellowship must tackle this. The whole group of the people of God must meet them head on. And so came the big battle. And in this battle, for the first time, God said, you must fight too. Remember when they'd been fighting the Egyptians, God said, stand still and see what I will do for you. In the beginning of your Christian life, God will fight your battles for you. But later on, he expects you to fight. It's part of growing up. And whereas at the beginning, in your first few days as a Christian, you can stand still and see what God will do for you, later on he'll say, now you fight. But the fight must be a double fight. Two things are needed, a sword and a rod. And you notice that the young men went down into the valley with swords, and the old men went up the hill with a rod. This is a picture of the people of God tackling a situation. Those who can do so into the front line. Older ones up on the mountain praying for those in the front line. This is the right way to tackle a spiritual battle. You older members, do you realize how important your task is in the Church of Christ? Even if you can't come out to services anymore, do you realize that you can be up the mountain holding up Moses' hands? That's where the old men were. There were old men up there. Aaron was old, Moses was old. And they were up there, holding up the rod of God, praying for those down below in the front line. It was very encouraging when our young people had their folk festival that so many of the older members of this church, even those who are now either so elderly or infirm that they can't even come to church, were praying them into the front line. And we're up the mountain, holding them up. This is the whole people of God operating together. The young men in the front line, getting on with the job. The older ones are way up there, backing them with prayer and praying for them. And you notice that as long as Moses' hands were up, the battle went well. But as soon as the hands began to flag, it went badly. So more help was needed, and his hands were held up by other people. What a picture of prayer and intercession for the battle in the front line. This is the combination. Here's a lesson they learned, that God expects us to fight. And we fight both with the sword in the practical way and with the rod in the prayerful way. I understand this to mean that prayer is hard work. I don't think it's right to think that you should only pray when you feel like it. Prayer is work. That is why on a Saturday morning when we have our prayer meeting, we expect everybody who comes to pray, because it's work. And for someone to turn up and not share in the work, that's a strange thing to do. It's hard work to pray. You roll your sleeves up spiritually and you get down to pray. And if you can't think of what to say, then you think hard to ask the Lord, what should I say? It's work. Or you can get tired in a prayer meeting. But Moses got tired, yet the others held him up and said, go on, pray until the battle's over. How long should you pray about a problem? Until it's gone. That's the answer. Not just once, twice, but until it's gone. We've had a lovely answer to prayer recently. It was reported yesterday. I think I should share it with you to show you the kind of battle that can happen. The Spratts took a car back to Africa with them, and they were told when they reached there by the authorities they had to pay £350 extra tax import on it, which they hadn't got to pay. And they didn't know what to do. What did they do? They sent a spiritual telegram here and said, what can we do about it? And we didn't say to you, can you fork out £350? We got to prayer. And we prayed that God would win the battle. And we've had an airmail letter on Friday to say the import tax has been cancelled. This is work. It's hard work to pray. And this is what we should be doing. Up the mountain as well as in the front line. Not just getting on with the job, but up the mountain and asking God to get the victory until the victory comes, that he may have the glory. And then you see, in the battle, when you've won the battle, when the prayer's been answered and you're through, you've found out something more about God. You've found a new name for God, Jehovah Nissi, which means God is our banner, which means God is our emblem, as it were. When the banner comes into the battlefield, the enemy sees that and runs. Do you know Jehovah Nissi? Jehovah Nissi is the God who wins the battle when the sword and the rod are both active. That's the God they learned in the valley of Rephidim. Finally, this morning, let me talk about something that was necessary within the people of God. They had won their battles with enemies outside, but they were now losing the battles between themselves. Bear in mind that here were a lot of people who had been slaves and always been told what to do by someone else. And they were now free. And they were now, as it were, able to do what they wished. And the result was they were crossing each other. They were arguing, they were disputing. The people of God, having come into the freedom of God, were now arguing with each other. And Moses was trying to keep them all happy. Moses was the pastor, the leader, the captain of this great number. And Moses was trying to settle every question that arose among the people of God. He had a pastor's hour that lasted 24 hours a day, apparently, or at least from morning till evening every day. And his father-in-law got worried about it. Now, there are some lovely touches here. I can see why he first got worried about it. You know, my daughter's getting no attention, no family life. But anyway, it was his father-in-law that came. And Jethro came and said, Moses, this is silly. You will not only wear yourself out, you'll wear the people of God out. It's not just you who'll suffer, they will suffer. They're hanging around all day to try and see you. That doesn't help. It means that some things are not getting dealt with as soon as they should, and therefore things can fester and disputes can grow and misunderstandings can snowball. Moses, you'll just have to do something about this. And Moses listened to his father-in-law. That's not a bad thing to do sometimes. And he took his advice and he took it to the Lord. As his father-in-law said, he said, don't listen to me. If the Lord agrees, then do this. And Moses tackled the basic problem of how to keep all the people of God happy with one another. And he realized that one man couldn't possibly do it. And that this was simply letting situations go by the board and go too far. So what did he do? When I realized what he did, I'm afraid I laughed out loud. I just found it so funny. He appointed 78,000 people to do his job. Now, I just find that one of the funniest things in the Bible. I've worked out very carefully, one for every 1,000, one for every 100, one for every 50, and one for every 10, and so on. And he needed 78,600, to be precise, to do his job. So clearly he was a bit overworked. Or they would be underworked. I don't know what. But what a sensible arrangement. He said, for example, every 10 people should have someone to look after them pastorally. That's a very sensible arrangement. Because 10 people can always feel they've got someone they could get hold of immediately, if one person only has 10. But then he said those people who each have 10 to look after, they should have someone to look after them. So he appointed one over every 5 of them. So there were 50 people at the bottom, then 5 people looking over them, and 1 people looking after those 5. You got the build-up? And then hundreds, and then thousands, and finally Moses. Now, he needed about 5 levels in that little pyramid to cope adequately with the numbers he had. On the same basis, our church would need 3 levels to cope adequately. At the moment, we have 2. We really need 3, and I'm going to be thoroughly practical and mention something that we are going to be considering very shortly. The numbers we have on this basis would need a pastor, elders, and pastoral visitors, each with 10, and an elder with 5 pastoral visitors. That's the kind of thing. You can work it out. So that everybody can get straight through to someone with their needs. And then if the needs are complicated or deep, then it can be passed on. And Moses was left to teach the general principles of God's laws. So he was teaching what God's laws were, and when an individual needed to work out how to apply it, they went to their captain of 10. And if the captain of 10 said, this is a bit too much for me, then they went on to the captain of 50, and so on. What a sensible arrangement. And I can guarantee that some of the older Israelis said, well, I always got through to Moses with my problems. And Moses hasn't been to visit me since we had elders. Can you see that being said? But you see, it was sensible. And Jethro was absolutely right. The harmony of the people of God would suffer if it remained a one-man band. He was absolutely right, because things would not be dealt with as they should. And so with divine common sense, he set a pattern which I think we would do well to take heed of today. And in this way, things went right. Finally, I'm going to say one more thing about dear old Jethro this morning. Here was a man, a very sensible man, a godly man in his own lights, a man who rejoiced in everything that God was doing for his people, a man who said to Moses, I'm just so proud of you as a son-in-law, and I'm just so glad to hear all that God has done through you and for you. But a man who never got to the promised land. He was a man who never left Egypt either. He was a man who was sympathetic, a man who rejoiced in what God was doing, a man who was glad to have a daughter of his married into such a people, and yet a man who never fully identified himself with the people of God and never went along with them. He was a man who comes into the story and goes out again. And he was such a sensible man and such a helpful man and such a good man. And you know, one of the difficulties or tragedies there is in every church are the men who are glad that their children come to Sunday school, that their wife is a member. And they're glad to hear of all that God is doing and the people is helping and saving, yet never fully identify, never get right into the people of God. The tragedy is that when Canaan is reached, those men may not be there. God grant that the Jethros of this world may become part of the people of God and walk with them through the wilderness and across the Jordan into the land flowing with milk and honey. Let us pray. Father, it's just so amazing that we can learn so much from things that happened so long ago. These incidents are way there in a desert that most of us have never even seen. And yet, Lord, their human hearts were the same as our hearts. We've been through these things. We've grumbled and complained, and we've doubted whether you would help us again. Father, forgive us. Grant us to be a happy band of pilgrims. Grant that we may win the battles with the enemy outside. And grant that we may remain in harmony among ourselves, caring for one another, building each other up, urging each other to feed and drink of Christ, until we all grow up to the stature of Him who is the head of the body, even our Lord Jesus Christ Himself, for His name's sake. Amen.